My favorite way to build up a long bead is to start at one side. For me, it's on the left-hand side, and I build up that bead slowly, moving to the right, one wrap at a time. And it's really important for me to not put two beads exactly side by side, but every time I put a wrap on there, I'll be putting it on the shoulder of the previous wrap. And the reason why is that way air can escape as I'm working. And when I get the bead to the length that I want, I won't have any air bubbles in there. And it's a way that I really like to work because it's slow and methodical, and I can really see the shape developing over time, and I can make judgments in a way that, for me, I don't think that I could make them if I were working any faster and rushing the process. So it's just personal choice. There are many ways to build up a long bead. Once the length is developed, then I can start, changing the shape and figuring out exactly the form that I want. But I like this kind of slow and methodical way of getting that length and developing the ends on either side the way that I want them. And just to say it again, each wrap that I put down is going to be touching the previous wrap. And the reason why I'm doing that is because if I put them side by side, there's a chance that I would trap a little air bubble in there, and I don't want to do that. So each wrap gets placed up on the shoulder of the previous wrap. I like to marver or roll the bead on a graphite plate placed right in front of the torch, and I prefer to do the marvering with my left hand, and it took some time to develop the skills in my left hand, but I really like the efficiency of marvering quickly without having to pick up a tool in my right hand or having to switch hands while I'm working. I prepare ahead of time a rod of glass that's doubled over, much like the shape of a tuning fork. This way, when I really want to make a large gather of glass, it's much easier to do with two rods next to each other. A single rod can work just as well, but I really like the efficiency of using two rods. Here again, just like the first wraps of glass on the mandrel, I'm trying not to trap air bubbles, but this time I'm putting the wraps well apart from each other. That leaves a valley, and I'm using heat to smooth out that valley and keep from any air bubbles being trapped, and then marvering it on the graphite smooths it out and starts to create the shape that I want. As I'm developing this shape, I tend to work on one side and try to perfect that form before going to the other side and matching it. And then eventually I'll work in the center. This way it really helps me keep a sense of balance and order to the symmetry of the form and the bead. This stage of the process can feel and is time consuming. What I'm after now is I want to establish the shape and the form of the bead that will remain at the end after the pattern is already put on there. If I were to think, oh, you know, I'll fix the bead at the end after the pattern is put on, then there's a risk of distorting or sliding any of the decoration that's put on the surface. So now is a great time to really sink in and think about that shape and that form. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm really taking my time and, you know, making the bead as, you know, as done as I can. The first row of dots is really the most important. This is where the spacing begins and will be carried out throughout the rest of the bead. And years back, I never touched a dot with a tool like I'm doing here. These days, I rather enjoy the little pushing and manipulating that can be done with a tiny knife blade. I like to make sure that the footprint of each dot is exactly where I want it to be, and I tend to maneuver each row now before going on to the next one. I want to make sure the dots are the right size. They're not too big and they're not too small. And once I establish that with that first row of dots, then after that, everything seems to kind of fall into place. I love using my regular 5 to 6 millimeter rod of glass for the very tiniest of dots. I like how the rod feels secure in my hand, and I love how I can produce a little drop of glass off the end. There are thin rods of glass, sort of the size of a piece of spaghetti, called stringers, that would logically seem like the thing to use. But when a bead is rather large, like this one, it can produce a lot of radiant heat. And I find that thin stringers can melt too quickly next to a large bead. So I just tend to stay away from them. And for making dots, even if they're tiny, I get pretty good results from using a regular, I'd say, large rod of glass. One of the trickiest parts of this step of placing dots down on a very long bead is keeping the length of the bead warm while you're working on it. I don't want to melt my dots down until the very end, so I'm keeping the bead and its decoration from getting too hot, all the while not letting it get too cold, because then the bead would crack. So that's really the biggest risk of working a bead that's shaped like this one. It's sort of the balance between, keeping it warm but not letting it get too cold, and being able to maneuver in and out, or to the right and the left of the flame, to keep everything warm at one time. In the beginning stages of getting the pattern down and established, I'll turn the flame down so that it's cooler in order to get like really precise dots. I like to put them down when they're relatively cold, so I have time to manipulate them. But then I have to be careful and make sure the bead stays warm. So I'll turn up the flame and I'll bathe it in heat, and make sure that it's not going to crack on the right and the left. And during this process, I really spend way more time reheating the bead than I do actively putting down the decoration. So it's a game of patience. I have to put down the in this case the ivory rod, reheat the bead, then I can put dots down. Reheat the bead, then I can put dots down. I often get asked how long it would take to make a bead like this, and this is definitely a solid 2 hour plus bead. I love the suspended time feeling that I get from working this way, and sort of this even, distribution of pattern on the right and the left, and getting lost in the details. Through the magic of editing, I've cut that down so you can see the process, but really here is kind of a moment in time that gets suspended and stretched out, and if you can forget about the maybe panic feeling of, oh no, the bead's going to crack, if you can really establish a way of sinking in some heat in between the moments of decoration and get lost in the pattern making, it's really an enjoyable process. Something that is really in the forefront of my mind as I'm finishing up the tiniest dots on the right hand and left hand ends of the bead is, again, the heat control. So if I happen to be working on, let's say, dots on the left-hand side of the bead, I need to make sure before I do that that I've heated up the right-hand side of the bead well enough that it can stay out of the flame for a while I'm putting the dots on the left-hand side of the bead. And so the same thing works on the other side. I need to take time, heat up, let's say, the left, so that I can work putting detailed dots on the right-hand side of the bead. So it's a little balance between the two, heating up the right, working on the left, heating up the left, working on the right. And then at times I'll heat up the whole entire bead, and I'll hold it a little bit more parallel to the flame and let the flame kind of wash over the entire part of the decoration and the center part of the bead, and then go back and work on the little details on the right and the left. But it's sort of a moment in time that's important not to forget to keep things warm as they get, let's say, the decoration gets further and further apart from each other. For this specific decoration or patterning that I'm after, this first layer of dots is the layer that I put down as carefully as I can. Once I establish this overall pattern, next I like to evaluate and make a decision on which dots I'd like to have larger. So the next layer of dots I'm going to put down is really just to enlarge the first pattern that was established, especially if I'm using the same color, in this case this ivory colored glass. I can go about this dotting much faster. I know that it's going to get melted in. I know how, I'm landing in that same spot that was already established, and I can be a little bit more almost free. And, compared to the last pattern of dots, I can feel almost messy about putting it down as long as I land on that same little footprint that I started with. And I'll jump around. I'll work, on different rows at different times, depending on where I want to keep the bead warm. How much glass do I put on each dot is really a question that I ask myself all the time. And it's really through time, not only working, but reflecting and considering, patterns in life, not only in my own work, but out in the world, and thinking about, how much space is happening in a surface pattern or between dots, and then trying to manipulate them, and, doing an experiment, and then reevaluating, and then trying another time, and, reconsidering. So it's this back and forth and thought process that I love, and that also enables me to work and make a decision fast at the torch when everything is hot. And then finally, or if there ever is a finally, once I'm satisfied with what I can see and the right amount of glass for each dot, I'll set to work heating the whole bead slowly and carefully. My goal here is to melt all the parts of the bead as regularly as possible so that the pattern sinks into the surface of the bead and no one single area melts before another. If one part melts faster than another, what can happen is you can risk a distortion of the pattern, and it almost looks like it could slip or slide off of the form, kind of cramming itself into another corner. So very slow, very steady, even heat at this point. I'm really careful at the very end when I marver or shape the glass on the graphite plate or the graphite paddle. If I work the surface of the bead when it's too hot, again, that can create a distortion or have the decoration slide or smear a little bit. So I'm really delicate about that marvering and that rolling, and trying not to be too aggressive as I try to think about it as sort of packing the design into the form of the bead. At this point, I could definitely say, the bead is done and finished. But lately, I've been putting these tiny little dots in the center of these larger ivory dots. One of the things I love about the ivory glass is after working it for so long, you can get this kind of extra visual curdling or crackle effect. Nothing's cracking, but it kind of has a crackly effect. And if I use a glass that is sort of supercharged with metals, here I'm using one that's made by Double Helix. They make a lot of specialty glass. And if you get one that reduces, then when you put it into a reduction flame right before putting it in the kiln, it can kind of change the surface of the glass, and that little dot can kind of look metallic, and then it affects and amplifies that wonderful crackling look that happens in the ivory glass. So it's something that I've been doing lately, and I absolutely love the effect. The next day when I take the bead out of the kiln, I'm always super careful about taking them off mandrels, and sometimes I use pliers. In this case, I'm using a vise because the bead is long, and I really want to make sure that that mandrel stays straight so I can use it again. And then also I can use two hands and very carefully take the bead off and make sure that I don't rush it, so I don't want to crack the back end of the bead. And there you have it, the final totem bead and all its little patterns. I hope for you flame workers and bead makers, you picked up a couple things that will help your own work move forward. And for everybody out there, happy making.